Good morning, everyone. Welcome. We are back for another episode of Music 1300. This is, of course, me, Professor George, and that is Willie, who occasionally makes an appearance in the videos. Today, we are concluding our lesson, or rather our unit on rhythm. We're going to take a moment to investigate one kind of genre of music that kind of blends the kind of popular music genre and the art music genre together, and that is minimalism. And the reason I say so is because there were a number of records released on vinyl in the late 70s and 80s, and honestly, occasionally in the 60s, that were minimalist pieces. And by minimalism, I mean a kind of music that aims to restrict some amount of the musical material. So often I think about visual arts when I'm thinking about their musical counterpoints. Minimalism in art is somewhat similar to minimalism in music. So we've talked a lot about the idea of homophonic texture, the idea of listening to melody, like the thing that's of primary importance, and then the thing that supports the melody, the accompaniment. In minimalist, so in regard to like art, that might look like portraiture or a selfie, the idea of looking at one subject first and foremost, and everything else is in the background. So like the video that you're looking at right now is homophonic in texture. There's no way it could possibly be monophonic. Not everything is the same layer, the same color, or the same texture, or anything like that. Texture in a different kind of visual or actual, like tangible sense, right? Now I've got a mannequin over here. If the mannequin were to be like an automatron or something like that, and could speak and had an actual head, like perhaps we could create polyphony, me and my mannequin together. But videos and certainly lecture style is going to be most easily understood if like you're listening to one thing first and foremost and everything else is sort of falling into the background. So in regards to minimalism and how that works in art, sometimes minimalism ends up making everything accompaniment and nothing the melodic interest. So the idea that we're then forced to kind of reevaluate what is of primary importance, and in a way that makes our ear shift around a lot. At this point, I'm going to show you my lecture notes for today's lecture, which I'm going to use a little bit more than I've used. Actually, I didn't use them at all in my previous 3 lectures, but these are important documents that I've put together for you that are a little bit easier to read than perhaps me writing on the whiteboard. So let me toggle over to my, my one sheet that I have scanned for you and talk a little bit over that. Okay, so here's the one sheet for today. So minimalism, minimalism in music. Like I said, that's about sort of withholding some amount of musical information. A lot of minimalist music also relies on the idea of gradual transformation, the idea of morphing color from one hue to another hue. And often minimalism uses abundantly ostinatos, repeating musical ideas that kind of fluctuate, that like either grow rhythmically or in terms of like volume or complexity, or the reverse, become more primitive. Often minimalism also has music that has like a kind of steady pulse or rate to it, or rate that gradually evolves. Again, the idea of incorporating transformation as one of the key elements of the aesthetic of minimalism. Often minimalism also has like the repetition of small ideas. Again, this is kind of built into the idea of ostinato, and that like these ideas kind of expand and contract, but that we're using an amount of consistency and inconsistency. Often when I'm thinking about minimalism, I think about not only like what it would look like in art, for example, blocks of color, where you might not necessarily be looking at like a subject that is supported by a background. But I also think of more intricate elements of minimalism in the visual realm. Hopefully you guys are aware of a kaleidoscope or have played with one. If not, I'm going to pull up some footage of a kaleidoscope. And kaleidoscope, you hold it, it's a sort of like a seeing eye piece. You hold it up to the sun, and like there are like rotating elements that change very slowly, that morph into different shapes, and that is an idea of gradual transformation, and something that we are going to hear sonically in minimalism. One of the reasons why I think it is so very interesting to listen to. So let me go ahead and pull up some footage of a kaleidoscope. Okay, so here is some footage of a kaleidoscope. We have these shapes and colors that like slowly morph into other shapes and colors. So we've listened to a lot of homophonic texture, melody and accompaniment, where we're listening to one thing first and foremost and everything else supporting that idea. Interestingly enough, when everything is kind of equally important, we're kind of left with polyphony as an option, which is interesting because for as repetitive and as slow moving as minimalism can be, the idea is that there are multiple different things to listen to that are all equally important. They're just all repeating. So we have a moment to listen to these like kind of individual things and take a moment to see how they work together. So minimalism is generally a more texturally complex music than we have listened to in popular music. Good to sort of mention that. But you guys can hopefully see that this feels significantly less homophonic than like my video looks, for example. I mean, yeah, there's a little bit of attention that's drawn to the center just based on the kind of orientation of the image. But like for me, like I, as a singular subject, have as much, if not more, pull than the center of that. And everything else in the background here is like just backdrop to of course, me. So let me stop this hypnotic kaleidoscope. All right, very good. So we're going to listen to music from 4 different minimalist composers. Minimalism, like my lecture notes say, it was like kind of like founded in the 1960s and became popular in the 60s, 70s, and into the 80s. Still remains popular today. Even within the sort of realm of vinyl, there was a lot of popular records that were released by some of these key artists that we're going to go through. So first on our list is Steve Reich. And Steve Reich is like I said, a minimalist composer, lives in New York City, and is also a performer of his music. Steve Reich uses, each of these minimalist composers that we're going to talk about kind of have their own entry into minimalism. And Steve Reich's entry into minimalism is using this thing that's called phasing. And phasing is when we start the same idea at the same time in 2 or more voices. One continues on at the same speed, and the other one gradually pushes ahead of the other. So you have these like two elements that are ongoing, and one is like gradually going faster. Usually I apply, because like my visual isn't quite, it's hard for me to phase with myself, and we'll talk about why that is. I apply a word problem to try to explain what phasing is. So imagine that our class is divided up into two buses, and we are going to travel around the world. Bus number 1 is going to travel around the world at a consistent rate of 60 miles an hour. Bus number 2 is going to start at 60 miles an hour, and for every hour of our journey, we are going to increase our speed by 1 mile per hour. So as we continue traveling around the world, as more time passes, there's more distance between bus 1 and bus 2. Eventually, because the world is indeed round, sorry everyone, we will eventually come back to the same spot. And that's essentially how phasing works. One way in which some of you might have encountered phasing, but it's a little bit more rare as I get older and you guys continue to be the same age, is poorly dubbed VHSs, and or where you were combining video and audio together. So it's really essential when you do that, that you actually do so at the same rate. There are a number of video projects out there where the beginning of the film seems to be synced up, but the end of the film is actually not in sync, and it's because they are essentially out of phase with one another. They are not actually monophonic, perfectly aligned together. They are slightly displaced. And that brings me to the idea of also what is happening texturally in phasing. It's a technique that starts out monophonically and very quickly moves to imitative polyphony. Why? Because both elements are equally important. So the best way for me to illustrate what's actually happening musically in phase is to play for you guys examples of phasing. So the first example of phasing we're going to listen to is by Steve Reich, and it's called Clapping Music. And clapping music has a ostinato, a repeating musical pattern. In this case, it's just rhythmic. It goes like this. Shaka-da, dika, dee, da, da, dee, da, da. It repeats again. Da, 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 dee, da, 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 da. 2 players or more are doing that. 1 player stays steady. The other player pushes ahead 1 clap every time it comes around. The piece ends when both players come back to the same point together. So texturally, what's happening here is we start off monophonic, we move to imitative polyphony. Why don't we discuss what happens rhythmically after our example? Let me pull it up. Okay, here we go. So what's nice about this one is that we're going to actually see the sheet music. So we can actually see how the phasing occurs. 1972 is our date here. Repeat Takes a while to get through all the phases, but that's also an example of something we call a piece of process music. Process music takes an idea, in this case it's a rhythmic idea, an ostinato, and it puts it through a musical system. What is our musical system? Phasing. We're going to listen to another piece of process music. Before we do so, let's talk about what's happening rhythmically here. So our ostinato is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 12 eighth notes long. So our time signature is likely 12/8. It's also like da ga da, di ga da, da da, di ga da. It's probably in, I'm guessing, but also making an educated guess based on the notation, that it's in simple compound time. However, when both players are doing the same thing at the same time, they're both in 12/8 at the same time. When one phases, they're at 12/8 at different times. We already have a word to describe what that means, and that is poly, many, metric, meters, right? Polymeter. Or what we would also call polyrhythmic on account of there being polymeter. Lots of really cool stuff today. Let's listen. You can also, though, like this is an example of phasing in units where everyone is like clapping within the beat. There's a different method of phasing, and that is called gradual phase. And gradual phasing kind of occupies the space in between beats. How do you do that? Well, just because like a second is the shortest amount of time that I see on my clock doesn't mean that there isn't there's no other duration aside from a second that is smaller. And the same happens for rhythmic space, obviously, time space, rhythmic space. So what's really interesting is this piece called piano phase occupies space in between beats. So it sounds somewhat similar to clapping music. We're going to be using two pianos, though. They're going to be repeating the same ostinato, a very rapid 12-note figure. One person stays completely steady. The other person gradually pushes ahead of the other person. In our word example problem, this would be the difference between like on the hour increasing our speed by 1 mile an hour, or over the course of an hour gradually increasing our speed until it is 1 mile an hour faster. So one is like a step, the previous example that we listened to. The other one is more of a ramp. So we're going to listen to the kind of like ramp style of phasing. What's interesting here is that there are moments that sound like kind of musical spaghetti, where it feels like really tangled in terms of the rhythmic energy. In this particular recording, the two players play the initial ostinato like only once together before they start the phasing. And what's interesting is that the players get to determine how long they are in each particular section before they move forward. As a result, piano phase can last, it has a very flexible duration. It can last anywhere from like under 20 minutes to over an hour if you really wanted it to. It really depends on your preference as a player. The longer it goes on, though, the sort of more disturbed our perception of time becomes. So because we're not listening to, or we're actually not given those sort of like place markers that we are typically given in popular music, we start losing track of time in minimalism very easily, which is a very cool experience as well. So let me go ahead and play you guys an example of piano phase. composite after we fade. New composite. We're going to then encounter another moment of spaghetti and then another composite. New composite. New composite. Very good. Okay. That performance happens to be just under 20 minutes. What I would really suggest is listening to it in full. Some of you might find minimalism to be incredibly tiresome. Others of you might find it to be incredibly meditative. I'm of the second party for sure. Before we leave the idea of phasing, well, before I even leave my previous idea, the reason I encourage you to listen to the whole thing is because it's one thing for me to explain how the perception of time is bended, but and like sort of compromised. It's another thing to experience it yourself. So I am usually in a class setting, I would play at least half of piano phase, but for the purposes of trying not to have this video cut to pieces by YouTube, I'm trying to keep the musical excerpts on the shorter side. And certainly if I need to include 10 minutes of video, like we'll link it at the bottom, which means that this one definitely included as a link at the bottom. Please listen to at least half of this. What you'll find is that when the place markers of things like choruses and verses are removed for you, it is much more difficult to perceive how time has passed. And that is a very interesting idea, but one that you can actually experience rather than me just explaining it to you. So one more example of phasing before we move on from Steve Reich and on to Philip Glass and end part one effectively, right? So drumming, we're gonna listen to phasing, but in a context where it's not the only musical constraint that's going on. So piano phase and clapping music are both examples of process music. Drumming just happens to involve some phasing elements to it. But this is how phasing can be used in combination with other compositional ideas. So without further ado, I will pull up drumming. So what's amazing about drumming is, well, first off, there's no sheet music. Everyone has to memorize this. Awesome. Cool. Really great piece. Drumming is in multiple parts. This just is one small section of it. And Steve Reich's music, for the most part, does rely on phasing more than other composers from the minimalist school. Texturally, what's been happening across the board here is a lot of monophonic texture that very quickly moves right to polyphonic texture, usually of the imitative variety. And the other thing that we heard here, which is very, very typical of a minimalist piece, is the idea of gradual transformation and the idea of like adding and subtracting from ideas. In this case, just rhythmic. Very cool piece though. Also, like, because it's just rhythmic, it kind of compromises our ability to determine texture a little bit more clearly. And that's one of the games that minimalist music ends up playing with you. This is just one composer who writes minimalist music. Philip Glass is going to be the composer that we investigate in session number 2, or section number 2 of this lecture, who uses not nearly as much phasing, but definitely has a kind of signature style. He's a composer who is more inclined to writing for voice and the operatic medium, so we will see what minimalism looks like when it has a visual component to it shortly. So I'll see you guys for part 2 soon.